Welcome to today's webinar. We'll be covering the Targeted Runoff Management Grant Application Cycle for the calendar year 2022 grant awards. I'm the Runoff Management Grants Program Coordinator at the DNR. The agenda for today's webinar includes an overview of the Targeted Runoff Management Program, or TRM grant program, information about what's changed since last year, and things to keep in mind as you fill out an application and complete the application process. So first, I'll provide a TRM program overview. In this overview, I'll first discuss what all TRM grants have in common. Then I'll explain the TRM grant categories, the differences in eligibilities for each type. Our TRM grant website can be found by going to the main DNR website and typing TRM in the search bar. Here you'll find tabs with information, applications, and important forms, and links to relevant laws. As you'll learn later in this presentation, there are 4 types of TRM grants. There is one urban TRM grant, the Smallscale Urban TMDL TRM grant. This is available on this website, but for the purposes of this webinar, I'll be focusing on the agricultural TRM grants only, as they're the most commonly used. The TRM program exists under the authority established in Statute 281.65 and NR 153. NR 154 identifies best management practices, technical standards, and cost share conditions that apply to the department, state agencies, governmental units, the Board of Regents, and cost share recipients when serving to provide or received cost share funds under Chapter NR 153 or NR 155. NR 151 establishes runoff pollution performance standards for non-agricultural facilities and transportation facilities, and performance standards and prohibitions for agricultural facilities and practices designed to achieve water quality standards. So who is eligible to apply for a TRM grant? Eligible applicants are governmental units. So a governmental unit means any unit of government, including but not limited to the following. So for example, a county or a city or a village, or the other governmental units listed here on the slide. There are certain things that all TRM grants have in common. So agricultural TRM grants provide cost share reimbursement for control of the non-point source agricultural pollution through the construction and implementation of agricultural best management practices, or BMPs. They offer up to 70% reimbursement of eligible costs in cases of no economic hardship, and up to 90% in cases of economic hardship. They only reimburse construction and implementation of BMPs for which no previous offer of NR 151 cost sharing has ever been made. So an offer of cost sharing means an offer of cost sharing as part of NR 151 notice or a county notice that meets the requirements of NR 151.09 or NR 151.095. And lastly, they only reimburse construction or implementation of BMPs located on sites that are not covered by the WPDES permits. So let's go into detail about some of these bullet points. TRM is a reimbursement grant program. What this means is that no money is provided by the state until money has been spent by the landowner to install BMPs. So under a typical TRM grant, the landowner spend their money to construct the project, then request reimbursement from the grantee. So that's step 2. And the grantee is typically a county in these cases. The grantee reimburses the landowner based on the cost share rate and the amount spent. Only after the project is constructed and the grantee reimburses the landowner does a grantee request and receive reimbursement from the state? So during the steps of the process that are shaded in gray here on the figure, grantee has paid money out and is reimbursed by the state in step 11. So this is one process. Option 2 is an acceptable deviation, and that's when the landowner completes the project and pays only their share of project costs directly to the vendor. So this is typically 30%. The grantee can then pay up to the cost share rate of eligible costs directly to the vendor. And this option is advantageous to the landowner because they only have to come up with their local share, or typically 30%, rather than the full costs and then wait to be reimbursed. The grantee still has to wait for reimbursement, however, and during the steps shaded in gray here, the grantee has paid out money and is reimbursed in the last step. So beginning about 4 years ago, we made a third option available that allows the grantee to request state share reimbursement from the DNR before reimbursing the landowner, as shown in this slide. The reason for adding this option was to increase feasibility of utilizing the TRM grant program in counties that don't have enough cash on hand to reimburse the landowner before being reimbursed by the DNR. So another thing that's the same for all TRM grants is that a higher cost share rate is available in cases of economic hardship. So I'm going to go in a bit more detail about this. So let's walk through the economic hardship criteria, which is established in State Rule NR 154.03. So in order for a landowner to meet the economic hardship criteria and qualify for the higher cost share rate, they must submit an application to the governmental unit, and the governmental unit makes the determination of economic hardship. So the landowner or land operator shall submit an application to the governmental unit in accordance with this subsection in order to be considered for a determination of economic hardship. The governmental unit may not make a determination of economic hardship for cost share purposes until it has received a completed application. The governmental unit referred to in NR 154 is the grantee, which is typically a county. So this means that the determination of economic hardship is typically made by a county based on their evaluation of an application submitted by a landowner. However, keep in mind that in order for DNR to reimburse the grantee at a higher cost share rate, the 90% rate must be in the grant agreement between the DNR and the county, so that any county that approves the economic hardship must communicate this to the DNR and get the higher cost share rate in the grant agreement. So the county would need to request a grant amendment to change the cost share rate, and ultimately the cost share agreement needs to reflect that rate as well. NR 154 provides the information that must be included in the application from the landowner to the grantee in order to evaluate whether economic hardship exists. So either a certified public accountant or an accredited financial institution must certify that the landowner is unable to make the 30% cost share contribution, which is normally required, but is able to make the 10% cost share contribution. So a link to NR 154 can be found on the TRM grant website. Additionally, NR 154 requires that the landowner provide a sworn affidavit that the information they provided to the CPA or the financial institution is a full and true disclosure of their financial condition. And while NR 154 does not give DNR authority to specify the method used to determine the economic hardship, it does give DNR authority to require that it approve the method used to determine economic hardship. So before we go to the next section, I'm going to pause to see if we have any questions specifically on what kind of all TRM grants have in common. Did we have any questions come in?
Thanks, Joanna. I'm not seeing questions right now, but just as a reminder, if you do have questions, you can put that in the chat box.
All right, I will go on.
Oh, we do have a question coming in.
Okay.
Let's see here. Wouldn't hiring an accountant to prove economic hardship be cost prohibitive?
Well, yes, it's possible that that might be an issue, but there is the option of the financial institution, and I don't know if they charge for those services or not.
Right. I think that's the only question we have right now. If we have other questions related to this section, we can answer those later on too if there's time.
Okay, I will go on.
Whitney, sorry, I did get a question come in. This is Joe.
Yeah.
Does DNR have a recommended format for hardship application, or is it all on the county?
I think we have some forms available, but Corinne, do you know if we actually have a form?
Yes, we do have some documentation and economic hardship determination forms available. I believe they're under the resources tab on the TRM grant website. I can verify that actually while we're having the webinar. But yes, there is some documentation forms to use. And it outlines all the necessary things that you need to gather to make that determination.
And I had another question come in. Just as a reminder, I'm more than happy to read the questions, but if you could direct your questions to Q&A, Corrine. But I got one too. Does the landowner contribution need to be cash or can it be in kind?
That I think there's a combination of that, but Corinne, maybe you can answer that better.
In-kind services are allowed in terms of, like the farmer actually doing some of the labor. So that can count towards the cost, the ultimate, overall cost of the project. And that can be factored in, yes. But it has to be directly tied to the practices that are being installed.
All right,
All
very
right.
good. Well, yep, again, just as a reminder, you can direct your questions to Q&A Corinne in the chat feature. We'll continue on.
All right. So now that we've gone over what all TRM grants have in common, let's look at the different types of agricultural TRM grants. So TRM grants are split into two different types based on the problem they address. So TMDL and non-TMDL, and size of the area, large and small scale. So we end up with 4 different types. TMDL TRM grants are for projects located in a watershed covered by an EPA-approved TMDL, total maximum daily loads, or an equivalent plan. TMDL TRM grants must implement the pollutant-specific goals of an EPA-approved TMDL. In the TRM grant program, BMPs are only eligible for cost share reimbursement if construction of the BMP either 1, achieves compliance with 1 or more currently non-compliant NR 151 agricultural performance standards and prohibitions, or 2, implements a TMDL. Because non-TMDL TRM grants aren't located in TMDL watersheds, they therefore must achieve compliance with 1 or more non-compliant NR 151 performance standards and prohibitions at facilities that are not now and have never previously been in compliance since the effective date of the applicable performance standard. And reimbursement is for compliance cost of existing facilities or cropland only. Oftentimes, however, NR 151 compliance is part of implementing a TMDL. So this means that while non-TMDL trim grants must address NR 151 noncompliance, TMDL trim grants may also address NR 151 noncompliance if doing so is required to implement the TMDL. However, unlike non-TMDL trim projects, TMDL trim projects can also cost share BMPs that exceed performance standards at sites already in compliance, if doing so is required for implementation of pollutant-specific TMDL goals. So in other words, if meeting the pollutant load reductions of a TMDL means going above and beyond just implementing performance standards, TRIM can fund this. And TMDL trim grants can also cost share BMPs that address pollution problems for which there's no performance standard, if doing so is required for implementation of pollutant-specific TMDL goals. So let's go through an example to better understand how TMDL and non-TMDL grants are different. For this example, the landowner wants to reduce pollution by stabilizing eroding stream banks. Is this an eligible non-TMDL trim project? And is it an eligible TMDL trim project? So let's consider the non-TMDL question first. Is stream bank stabilization an eligible non-TMDL trim project? And the answer to this is yes. Because this is non-TMDL project, the project must address non-compliance with an NR 151 performance standard. For example, in this photo, we see a situation in which erosion appears to be caused by unlimited livestock access to the stream. So here's a list of the agricultural performance standards and prohibitions from one of the TRIM grant applications. Listed at the bottom of the agricultural prohibition is the agricultural prohibition prevention of unlimited livestock access to waters of the state where high concentration of animals prevent the maintenance of adequate sod cover or self-sustaining vegetation. So if the project is stabilizing stream bank as part of addressing the noncompliance through fencing or relocation, then yes, this is an eligible non-TMDL trim project. You can see the same site in this photo. The stream banks have been revegetated and the animals no longer have unlimited access to the stream. So let's consider the TMDL scenario. Is stream bank stabilization an eligible TMDL trim project? We already learned that both TMDL and non-TMDL trim grants can address noncompliance with NR 151. So the answer has to be yes for the same reason and under the same conditions for the non-TMDL projects, under the same conditions that the non-TMDL projects are eligible. So are there any conditions under which a TMDL trim grant could fund stream bank practices? We learned earlier that TMDL projects can also address pollution sources for which there's no performance standard. So let's consider a scenario in which stream bank erosion is not caused by noncompliance, such as unlimited animal access, rather by changes in the watershed hydrology due to agricultural land use in the upstream watershed. There's no performance standard that addresses erosion due to upstream changes in hydrology, even though this can be a significant pollution source. So in such instances, stream bank stabilization would be an eligible TMDL trim project, as long as the land use in the upstream watershed causing the erosion is agricultural, and as long as the stream bank stabilization implements the pollutant-specific goals of the TMDL. So let's look at the second way that agricultural trim grants are divided. So we have large scale and small scale projects. As their name suggests, large scale trim grants cover a larger area than small scale. Specifically, small-scale trim grant projects typically cover an individual farm or site, whereas large-scale trim projects cover a watershed. For non-TMDL large-scale trim projects, the size of the watershed addressed must be between 8 and 39 square miles, whereas the size of a large-scale TMDL trim watershed size is determined by the size of the TMDL watershed, or if it's for larger TMDLs, the size of the TMDL watershed reach. The maximum grant award for small scale projects is $225,000, and for large scale is $600,000. And this is, keep in mind that it used to be $1 million, and last year we made that change. So this will be the second year that the applications, that the large scale trim grants will have a maximum award of $600,000. The small scale trim grant period is 2 years, whereas the large scale trim grant period is 3 years. Both large and small scale trim grantees may request a 1-year project extension. However, extensions are not guaranteed, and grantees cannot apply for a grant with a project schedule that intends to take more than allowed by the initial grant period. Another difference between large and small scale trim grants are the type of project expenses that they can fund. In addition to reimbursing BMP construction costs, small scale trim grantees can request force account reimbursement. The maximum amount of force account that can be reimbursed is 5% of the state share amount reimbursed under that trim grant project. Large-scale trim grantees cannot request force account, but can instead request local assistance. The maximum amount of local assistance that can be reimbursed is 40% of the amount reimbursed for BMPs. And this also changed. It had been 10%, and last year we made that change to be 40%. So what's the difference between force account and local assistance? So we'll go into a bit more detail. Force account is work done by the grantee's own employees or by the grantee's own equipment that is directly related to the design and construction of BMPs constructed by the project. And this is used in small scale trim grants. Local assistance is reimbursed for staffing activities needed to carry out the project. Although local assistance activities must be project related, they don't have to be directly related to the design and construction of installed BMPs. So there is more flexibility. Local assistance is used in large-scale trim grants. So some examples of eligible local assistance activities are listed on this slide here. The full list of eligible local assistance activities can be found in NR 153.16. So another difference between the two grant categories is the type of BMPs the program can reimburse. Small scale trim grants can only reimburse construction of structural BMPs, whereas large scale can also reimburse implementation of cropping practices. Another difference is that small scale trim grants can only fund nutrient management plans development if the nutrient management plan is developed in conjunction with manure storage or barnyard runoff control. That is also funded as part of the same trim grant. Large-scale trim grants can fund a nutrient management plan as a standalone practice. So let's look at how the funding is allocated for trim grants. By far, the majority of funding for trim grants comes from state bond revenue. Bond revenue can be used anywhere in the state, but it can only be used for construction of structural practices or force account, or activities directly related to the construction of structural practices. It can reimburse nutrient management plans only when part of a project that includes construction of manure storage or barnyard. And you can see from this pie chart that the green part of the funding, representing the bond revenue, comprises almost 3/4 of the overall program budget. And this is just a typical year of program budget. These aren't exact numbers here. Federal 319 project funds also comprise a significant piece of the overall funding available and can be used for both cropping practices and local assistance. However, these funds can only reimburse work done in areas covered by an EPA-approved 9 key element plan. State segregated funds can be used anywhere in the state and can be used for cropping practices and local assistance. Unfortunately, segregated funds comprise a very small sliver of the overall funding available to this project. Over the years, the amount of funding available for cropping practices and local assistance has been so limited, both in terms of the amount and where it can be used in the state. The department made the decision a number of years ago to prioritize the use of these funds in areas where resources are focused on implementing practices throughout a watershed, such as a large-scale TRM project. And the reason is there's much more likely to be a perceivable impact of such practices on water quality when their implementation is focused within a watershed rather than a shotgun approach. Oops. So we've learned that both non-TMDL and TMDL grants can fund NR 151 performance standard compliance at facilities that are not now and have never previously been in compliance since the effective date of the applicable performance standard. And reimbursement is for compliance costs of existing facilities and croplands only. This type of TRM project, NR 151 compliance, is frequently the source of confusion with the program. Specifically, there is a common confusion regarding how to determine whether or not a particular facility meets the eligibility criteria. So to help clear some things up, let's go through some example scenarios and to try to determine if they would be eligible for TRM grants to address NR 151 noncompliance. Since non-TMDL TRM grants must address NR 151 noncompliance, I'll refer to this project type as a non-TMDL TRM grant as we go through examples. But keep in mind that some TMDL TRM grants also address NR 151 noncompliance, and when they do, the same eligibility criteria apply. So here are some examples of eligibility. In the first example, we have a livestock facility that's been in existence since before the effective date of the performance standard being addressed by the project. During the time since the performance standard went into effect, the facility has expanded from 500 animal units to 600 animal units. Is this site eligible for a non-TMDL agricultural TRM grant? And the answer is it depends. Based on this information, we do not have enough to make that determination. Knowing how many animal units we have doesn't tell us whether the site is eligible for a grant. So we'll add some more information. Now we have here the performance standard status. So before the effective date, it was compliant, and now it is non-compliant. In this example, the project is not eligible, even though the site existed at the time of the performance standard went into effect. It was in compliance at the time the performance standard went into effect. So in order to be eligible for a non-TMDL TRM grant, the facility must be not now and never previously been in compliance since the effective date of the applicable performance standard. If a facility falls out of compliance due to expansion, it is not eligible for a non-TMDL TRM. So here's another example. The status was non-compliant and now it's compliant. In this case, the project is not eligible because the facility is already in compliance. In this example, the performance standard status was non-compliant before the effective date and is still non-compliant. So this project is eligible. It was in existence and has continuously been non-compliant. So how can it be eligible when the number of animal units has increased from 500 to 600? The reason is that the magnitude of the expansion is not significant as defined by NR 153.15. In this last example, the facility has undergone significant expansion. So like the previous scenario, the site was in existence and continuously non-compliant since the effective date of the applicable NR 151 performance standards. However, unlike the previous scenarios, the number of animal units has increased from 200 to 900. This project is eligible, but only the cost of bringing the facilities in existence on the effective date of the performance standard and prohibition are eligible for cost sharing. So if the landowner is designing a facility for all 900 animal units, the eligible costs must be prorated by determining the base animal units that existed when the performance standard went into effect, and then calculating a non-significant expansion of that number. In this case, a non-significant expansion of 200 animal units is 250 animal units. Since the facility was designed for 900 animal units, the applicant would divide 250 by 900 and determine that 28% of the total project costs are eligible for cost sharing. If this is confusing, don't worry. The application form is set up to calculate this all for you. So if you enter yes to the question about whether the application is a livestock facility, the application will prompt you to enter the number of base and designed animal units into Part 3B of the small scale TRM application. And the application will tell you, one, if the proposed increase considered significant or non-significant? And if it's considered significant, what the percentage by which eligible costs must be prorated. So I'm now going to take a break for more questions.
All right, great. Thanks, Joanna. We have a few coming in right now. The first one is, how much of the watershed needs to be agricultural for stream bank stabilization projects to be covered?
I mean, we could prorate as well. I don't know, Corinne?
Yeah, let me dive in here. I think the important thing is to remember that for a large scale project, it needs to be dealing with agricultural sources of non-point source pollution. So if you have a watershed that is at least 50% agricultural, we will deem that watershed to be agricultural for the sake of applying. So just keep that in mind. So we have small scale agricultural and we have small scale urban TMDL projects. And so it really comes down to the watershed and the makeup of the watershed. So if you are going to apply for either a small scale or a large scale, if it's going to be a small scale ag, it's going to have to be greater than 50% ag. For large scale, it has to be agricultural in order to be eligible. If you're in a TMDL area, you do have the ability to apply for an urban TMDL trim project for stream bank restoration if it's not greater than 50% ag.
Thanks.
So it really comes down to the land use in the drainage area coming to the project area, the restoration area.
All right, sounds good. Next question. What is considered a TMDL equivalent plan to be eligible for the TMDL categories?
That is a good question. We last year determined that a 9 key element plan can be considered an equivalent plan to a TMDL, so an approved 9 key element plan. It does need to have a few criteria. A few things need to be in the 9 key element plan, and I could certainly send that out, find those and send that out later.
And Joanna, as we got that question, I went to the large-scale TRM application. For anybody that's thinking about this equivalency, I would refer you to attachment B in the large-scale TRM application. There are recommended components of a watershed plan recommended in there that deals with projects that are non-TMDL, but it also serves as a good guide for that equivalency to TMDLs. It's really looking at the TMDL, kind of the TMDL outline. You want to look at, essentially finding those equivalent components in a watershed plan that are equivalent to those things that are required in a TMDL. And so we kind of hold them side by side to make sure that they're there.
All right. So we have a couple of questions that came in that are a little site specific. So if you are one of those folks that asked a question about a specific situation, we will follow up with you after the webinar on that question. But I think for right now, that is all the questions that we have that are more general. So Joanna, you can continue on.
Okay. So now I'm going to go over a few things that have changed since last year. So we have made changes to all of the TRM grant instructions, mostly to make the formatting consistent among all of them. The scoring criteria are more clearly outlined, and we also removed language about the submission of hard copies, and we are now officially accepting and prefer electronic submissions. So we made changes, as I said, to all of them, specifically the small scale urban TMDL trim and the large scale trim, to be more specific with the small scale, to be more consistent with the small scale trim applications. But I'm going to talk specifically about some changes we made to the large scale trim application. So we revised the location of the project area, allowing for multiple counties and removing many fields that weren't being used. We also revised the water body section and removed the section on the question on WBI. The water quality need question was reconfigured to match the small scale agricultural trim application. It had been a paragraph response, and we now have it as a drop-down. We reformatted the section on cost estimate and cost containment to more closely match the small scale agricultural trim grant application. And again, this had been a paragraph, and it is now like a checkbox selection or multiple choice. And we also reformatted the inventory and targeting questions, which had been 3 parts, are now 2 parts, and we tried to clarify what was asked for in each of the sections. So I'm going to go over a few things related to the application instructions and application requirements. So each page of the instructions has a header that indicates the part and question of the application covered on that page. And additionally, instructions are divided into columns. So there's directions on the left side and an explanation on the right side. As part of the grant process, it's required that the grantee identify and establish an authorized responsible government official, or ARGO. The ARGO is the only person that will be able to sign and submit grant agreements, amendment requests, reimbursement claims, and interim and final reports on behalf of the grantee. So make sure the person authorized by the grantee is the person that will be doing this. An executed government responsibility resolution, or what we call a GRR, is required to establish an authorized responsible government official. So if you don't already have one, you may need to set up a council or board meeting to get one created. The DNR recommends using a job title rather than a name in the authorizing resolution, so you don't need to execute a new one if there is any staff turnover. So this slide shows the GRR template to be used by the grantee in establishing their ARGO. The GRR must include language in this blue box. Pay special attention to the required bullets. So some applicants prefer using their own format for the GRR, and that doesn't matter, but just make sure that the content is in there that needs to be. So here I've listed a few questions to think about before you begin a grant application process. And the answers to these questions will help you and your non-point source coordinator figure out if you're applying for the appropriate grant and if your project is eligible. So make sure you know the answers to these. Are you trying to address a non-point source pollution problem? Which BMP or BMPs do you have planned? Is the project in a TMDL area? And how do you plan to meet the TMDL goals in this project? Or maybe the project is addressing non-compliance with an NR 151 PS&P. Is it existing non-compliance? Are you a local unit of government? And what is the water quality need? And of course, there are many more, but these are some of the initial questions that you may want to think about, making sure that you're applying for the correct grant. So lastly, one of the grant application fillers and requirements is to contact your regional non-point source program coordinator to discuss your project. So this is a reminder to contact them early. Don't wait till the week before the deadline. A month or two beforehand is preferred. And make sure you discuss the following subjects for sure at a minimum: project eligibility, prorating eligible costs if applicable, proposed BMPs, permits and other feasibility issues, and the water quality need. So if you're not sure who your DNR non-point source coordinator is, here's a map with all of the contacts, and I'll leave this up. Actually, I'm going to go to the last slide. I'll come back to this. So we'll take questions. Keep in mind that the applications are due, postmarked and mailed or emailed by April 15th. So I'm going to go back to this slide, leave this up if you have questions on who to contact to discuss your project, and I can take other questions.
We don't have any additional ones at this time, Joanna, but I do want to backtrack a little bit on the economic hardship topic,
Sure.
if I could really quickly. I just wanted to be clear that yes, there are forms on the resources tab of the DNR website. There's an affidavit form for the landowner to fill out and have notarized. And there's also the economic hardship determination form that grantees need to complete and send to the department to show that they've gathered the necessary documentation to show economic hardship, or that, you know, that the landowner is showing economic hardship. So I just wanted to remind people that that's there. We do see in kind of the economy that we're living in, more cases of economic hardship coming in. So it's becoming a bit more popular of a form coming to the department. So go to the resources tab and check it out. And if you have any questions, check with your regional on-point coordinator. They should be able to help you out.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Joanna and Corrine. Again, if you have any questions, you can enter those into the chat box. I am going to launch a quick poll here. This is just collecting some demographic data that we at Extension are asked to do to support our funding. So if you wouldn't mind taking that quickly, and then we will continue to monitor the chat box for those of you who have any last questions for Joanna and Corrine. Oh, looks like we do have a question coming in here, Joanna.
Okay.
What happens if a small scale project ends up being more expensive than originally expected?
So there's always the option so that may depend on what type of practice it is. If small scales are funded mostly with bond revenue, so might be a little more flexible. We may end up having some underspending that can be used later in the year, but it's not a guarantee. So what happens is you fill out an amendment request, and then it goes to the non-point source. You work with your non-point source coordinator, goes to the to Corrine, and then the grants team makes a decision to if we have the funding.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to having the best estimates that you can possibly have in your grant application. Getting as close to what you think is going to be the ultimate project cost. But we certainly understand that things do change, things do can affect costs during project implementation. And it doesn't hurt to request an amendment. We can't guarantee it, as Joanna said. It's all based on if we have available funds, but you can certainly try, but we just can't guarantee it necessarily that
Right.
you get those available funds.
And I think it also depends on what Corrine said. I mean, if you've done your best and there are things out of your control as to why the cost increased, and you have a good case for why you didn't know that previously, then that's good information and helpful.
All right, we have another question coming in. Are engineering services cost shareable, and is there a limit?
Yes, they are cost shareable, depending if they're associated with the BMP. Is there a limit in terms of the cost share rate or the amount? I mean, there would still be the cost share rate. Maybe you can address this, Corrine.
Yeah, no, there is a limit if the engineering work is being done by the county itself.
Oh, right.
Yep, and that was based on a bond council decision long time ago. So in general, engineering services are cost shareable at the same cost share rate as the BMPs. So generally 70%. And it's capped at 5% of the state share amount spent on the practices. So if you're end up getting reimbursed $50,000 for the practices, 5% of that is the cap then for engineering, if the county is the one doing the work. There is no cap, and again, this is based on the bond council decision. There is no cap on engineering, apart from the cost share rate, if that is done by a private consultant.
All right. Are there any last minute questions out there? If not, we will just wrap up a little bit early today. Thank you so much, Joanna and Corrine, for sharing this great information with everyone. Thank you for participating, and we wish you luck in your application writing.
Yes, thank you all for attending, and we look forward to talking with you over the next month or so.
And actually, Joanna, as I was speaking, we've got another question that's coming in.
All right.
Is there any intention of providing a webinar focused on urban trim grants? I know our municipal clients would be interested in this.
I think that's a good question. we have not done one in the past because we really hadn't received very many, but it does seem like we did receive some last year, and it does seem like it may be a more popular option as we move forward. So that is something we could definitely do. I don't know if we can do it in time for this year, but we did redo, as I mentioned, all the instructions, and they're much more clear now. But we will definitely keep that in mind for next year. I think that is a good question.
Okay. All right. And I think we've got a couple of questions that are specific to projects. So again, we'll be following up with those individuals. If we have not answered your question, that is why we'll be following up with you directly after the webinar on your specific project questions. All right. Well, I think we'll wrap up here. I don't see any more questions coming in. Thank you again, and we will be sharing the recordings later next week with everyone.